Despite being one of the smallest countries in Europe, Malta endured one of the fiercest sieges of the Second World War. With the neutralisation of the French Mediterranean bases and the Axis progress in North Africa, the island became increasingly isolated. Fortunately, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave it strong support, despite early advice from some Royal Navy senior staff officers that it was indefensible. In this video, we'll cover why this small island fortress was so strategically important for the Axis and the Allies, and why they were willing to suffer heavy losses fighting to control her. Malta is nestled in the central Mediterranean, and the land is almost entirely flat except for the fortresses that cover her coastline and the grand harbour of Valletta. Malta lies around 58 miles south of Sicily and 180 miles from the North African coast. She held a population of 275,000 people on an island only 17.5 miles long and 8 miles wide. Malta was spared from the war raging in Europe until June of 1940, when Mussolini's Kingdom of Italy declared war on Britain, and therefore Malta. Within hours, the first Italian air raids began. This act of aggression initiated a prolonged siege of the island by German and Italian forces that lasted for almost 2.5 years. Malta's strategic location in the Mediterranean Sea made it a vital base for the Allies, disrupting Axis supply lines and supporting operations in North Africa. The Axis powers hoped to starve and bomb the island into submission. In August 1942, the Allies launched Operation Pedestal, a convoy that brought supplies and reinforcements to Malta, helping it survive the siege. This was extremely costly, but it was considered a strategic victory. The island has been strategically important throughout history because of its location in the Mediterranean. Its history has been marked with numerous foreign influences, from ancient civilizations to European powers. Relatively recently in its history, in 1798, Napoleon invaded and captured Malta as part of his campaign in the Mediterranean and his subsequent invasion of Egypt. It was occupied by France until 1800, when the Maltese people revolted and appealed to Britain for assistance. The French capitulated and it became a British protectorate, and then a British Crown colony in 1813 until it gained independence in 1964. Malta was a British Crown colony when Mussolini declared war in June 1940. Britain therefore had an obligation to defend the Maltese people, British interests and the war effort. However, at the outbreak of the war, Malta only produced around 30% of its own food supply, had no stocks of food, and there were only 14 coastal defence guns, 1 airfield, and 2 flights of 3 obsolete Sea Gladiator biplane fighters. Supplies of food and fuel would need to be sailed in through the treacherous Mediterranean, and would therefore always be scarce. The Maltese people were unwavering in their stand against the Axis powers, particularly during the intense siege from June 1940 to late 1942. The island faced relentless assaults by the Italian and German air forces, aiming to subdue the strategically vital island. Malta held against the siege, and was statistically the most heavily bombed country of the war per square mile. This exacted a heavy toll on Malta's people, and Malta commands aircraft, pilots, munitions, materials, and most importantly fuel. Between June 1940 and April 1941, when the air forces on Malta were limited to a handful of Sea Gladiators and later Hurricanes and Fulmars, their fighters destroyed 96 enemy aircraft, with the loss of 16 of their own. Many of the pilots would become aces, including Flight Sergeant Ian Roy McLennan with 7 kills, Flight Sergeant Wilbert Dodd with 4 kills, and most famously, the Knight of Malta, Flight Officer George Buzz Burling, Canada's top-scoring fighter ace of the war, who shot down 27 aircraft in 14 days, before his total eventually rose to 31 1/3. In April 1942, the worst month of the bombardment, Malta's anti-aircraft batteries, now strewn across the island's dockyards, airfields and fortifications, shot down more than 100 German aircraft alone. In 1942, the loyalty, bravery and resistance of the RAF and the people of Malta was recognised by King George VI. During the worst month of the siege, on the 15th of April 1942, Secretary of State for the Colonies, Robert Gascoigne Cecil, relayed the following message. I have it in command from the King to convey unto you the following message. To honour her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta, to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history. To the Royal Navy, Malta served as an essential bridge that connected British territories in the West and East Mediterranean. Control of Malta allowed Gibraltar, the southernmost tip of the Iberian Peninsula, and Alexandria, a key port on Egypt's northern coastline, to be connected, and for the Royal Navy to maintain a sea route between the two. For Britain, Malta was in the very centre of her most important trade routes. The Suez Canal and Mediterranean was the shortest and most preferred route to connect Britain to her empire east of Suez, and to the oil fields of the Middle East. With Italy's entry into the war, and the beginning of the North Africa campaign, British forces on Malta had the ability to harass and sink the supplies that were being sent to the Axis forces there. The war in the Mediterranean hinged upon supplies, and on the capacity of both Allies and Axis to reinforce themselves across a limited area of sea, and then across long stretches of difficult desert. Malta's geographical position was vitally important in this supply conflict. As German historian Hans Adolf Jakobsen observes, the British regarded the Mediterranean as the lifeline of their empire, and their objective was to secure control of the sea and the air, and if possible, the control of North Africa as a whole. Had Malta succumbed, Axis ships would have been free to supply and reinforce German and Italian land forces fighting the British Army in North Africa. Egypt might well have fallen, and eventually the Middle Eastern oil fields would have fallen to Axis powers, a commodity so sought after and vital to them in their war against the Allies. Malta was within range to strike nearly all of the Axis north-south lines of communication and convoys with North Africa. As a result of their harassing efforts, Axis armies suffered. However, according to some historians, Hitler was never truly convinced of Malta's importance. He was concerned about the impact the island was having in hampering Rommel's advances in North Africa due to supply shortages, but he failed to recognise the long-term effects the island could have. To Hitler, Malta could easily be replaced by Tobruk. Jakobsen contends, in his view, Malta was not all that important, as he was firmly convinced that Rommel's new offensive could take Tobruk. Then, the Italian-German supply line across the Mediterranean could run under the protection of Crete to this harbour, so conveniently near to the front line. Despite fluctuating interest, it wouldn't be until the 13th of February 1942 that Hitler would finally listen to Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, a man who believed in Malta's importance. The Africa Corps that Hitler loved so dearly was under constant threat. Around 60% of Axis shipping was lost en route, most of which was lost to British forces on Malta. Rommel soon expressed the same sentiment as Admiral Raeder, with his Chief of Staff, Fritz Bauerlein, saying, "Until the air and naval base at Malta ceased to act as a constant thorn in the flesh of our rearward communications, there was not possibility of the situation at the front improving, and therefore no prospect of capturing the Nile Delta." Despite conquering Tobruk in 1942, the supply issue was never truly solved. As Rommel advanced onto Egypt, each mile advanced lengthened his supply lines and shortened the enemy's. British efforts from Malta were stepping up once more, and in July 1942, 17% of Axis shipping to Tobruk was sunk. By September, this had risen to 38%. At the end of October, Montgomery's 8th Army would break through at El Alamein, and the momentum of the North Africa campaign would be permanently changed. For the Allies, Malta also served as an essential intelligence collection, interception and dissemination platform in the heart of the Mediterranean and near to Italy. From its airfield, the Royal Air Force would fly reconnaissance sorties over Sicily, North Africa, Greece and mainland Italy itself to take photographs, monitor movements and record dispositions of troops, warships, aircraft and installations. Reconnaissance sorties would also work in conjunction with the Royal Navy to locate and shadow Axis convoys heading for North Africa and guiding the Royal Navy onto their targets. The Royal Navy itself was also gathering intelligence. Based from Malta, the 10th Submarine Flotilla freely sailed into the central Mediterranean and often the Tyrrhenian Sea, where it would report, monitor, hunt and sink the ships of the Regia Marina and Axis merchant convoys. Over 1 million tons of shipping are sunk sailing from Italy to North Africa by the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. Of great importance was Malta's role in the Ultra programme. One of the greatest secrets of the war was the Allied acquisition of the German Enigma cryptographic machine. With one Enigma device, the men and women of Bletchley Park were able to break the German cryptographic code. Malta was one of the Ultra programme's most productive outposts. Perfectly situated in the central Mediterranean, Malta was able to intercept Axis communications between Italy and North Africa. In August 1942, Ultra provided intelligence to the Allies that successfully thwarted a near-decisive offensive by Rommel and his Africa Corps. 2 months later, in October, Ultra again provided intelligence outlining the shipping routes and supply lines to North Africa, keeping the Axis campaign alive. These convoys were promptly attacked by both the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. In November, Ultra provided essential intelligence giving the green light for Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. Ultra's outpost on Malta continued to be of use well into 1943, when in July, Ultra provided reports of enemy troop concentrations in Sicily, which prompted US General Patton to alter his landing points on the island to avoid a costly confrontation. In January 1943, 2 months after Malta was freed from its siege, 2 large convoys arrived which fully restocked Malta's offensive capabilities, and with that, the island reassumed its offensive posture. The Royal Air Force and Royal Navy would reignite their offensive campaigns, striking at the heart of Rommel and von Arnim's supply lines, as well as venturing further north towards installations and airfields in Sicily and mainland Italy. By the end of March 1943, the grand total enemy tonnage destroyed by aircraft and ships based on Malta had passed 1 million tons, devastating for Axis forces in North Africa. By May, General von Arnim and 200,000 Axis troops would surrender unconditionally. Upon the collapse of the Axis North African campaign, Allied attention switched to the invasions of Sicily with Operation Husky and mainland Italy with Operation Avalanche. Malta served as an essential supply hub for both. The Royal Air Force would fly reconnaissance and bombing sorties to strike targets in support of the invasion. The island of Malta rose to international acclaim as a result of its defiant stand and its steadfast resilience in the face of an ever-worsening and debilitating siege. Upon learning of the destination, many crew taking part in the Operation Pedestal convoy recall a feeling of necessity, duty and obligation when it came to ensuring the convoy was a success. Upon its completion, many said they would be willing to do it again. Should Malta have fallen through invasion or surrender, her loss would have hit morale across the Mediterranean. The conquering of Malta would have allowed for the further allocation of resources to the North African front, which would have strengthened Rommel's advance into Egypt and reinvigorated his troops in a distant, unfamiliar desert landscape. Winston Churchill knew that attacking supplies to North Africa would eventually starve the Axis forces there, allowing for its conquest, and from North Africa, Allied forces would be able to springboard north into Sicily, mainland Italy, and southern France. At the risk of greater loss of life and equipment, the British made a valiant effort to keep Malta supplied with Operation Pedestal. Where Mussolini and a number of senior military commanders were aware of the importance of conquering Malta and the benefits it would bring for the remainder of his Mediterranean campaign, his ally Hitler did not. Hitler never quite grasped the importance of Malta to the wider war effort. To Hitler, the conquering of Tobruk would solve the supply issue in the Mediterranean, and thus any plan to invade Malta was deflated in importance. Hitler's interest was fickle at best. Even with Malta on its knees, neither Mussolini nor Hitler took advantage, instead allowing the Allies to bolster the island, for which they were eventually punished.